Roger Cohen, currently the Paris bureau chief, has worked for the New York Times for 33 years as a foreign correspondent, foreign editor, and an opinion columnist between 2009 and 2020. I know numbers. His work has been recognized with several awards, including a 2023 Pulitzer Prize and George Polk Award as part of the Times team's coverage of the war in Ukraine. As foreign editor, he oversaw post 9/11 international coverage in a year that the Times won 7 Pulitzers. Prior to joining the Times, he worked for the Wall Street Journal and Reuters. Raised in South Africa and England and an Oxford graduate, he is a naturalized American and the author of 5 books, including a family memoir entitled The Girl from Human Street, Ghosts of Memory in a Jewish Family, and the recent An Affirming Flame, Meditations on Life and Politics. He has taught at Harvard and Princeton. Before I turn it over to our very special guest, Roger Cohen, and on behalf of myself and Richland Library, we want to thank you for joining us and to send a very special heartfelt thanks to our friends and partners at the South Carolina Council on the Holocaust, who have been there from the beginning with this very long project that we've been working on. And they are gracious sponsors of this event and many others that are a part of this exhibition. Thank you so much. We are proud to bring this exhibition to this community, and we look forward to the conversations it will spark. Americans and the Holocaust will be on display in our gallery until August 18th. And now, without further ado, I present Roger Cohen. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for that, Ashley, and thank you, Lily Filler, for finally getting me here. This is a program that has been planned for about 4 years. It has encountered repeated obstacles, chief among them COVID, and it shows you what dogged persistence can produce, because I am finally here. And Ashley, you've been absolutely amazing. Thank you very much. Lily, Lee Snellgrove, who met me at the airport, Melanie, who is here tonight, who is the director of this library. I am most grateful. I have seen the very fine exhibition today, and I have a few thoughts that reflect my career, a last rather long career at this point as a journalist, in which I've encountered these themes multiple times. And I thought I would give you a few of my reflections, and then we can have a Q&A session, and you can ask me any questions you wish. There are the facts, and then there is the memory of them. There is the horror, and then there is the capacity not to see it. There is truth, and then there is evasion. There is history, and then there are its uses. I have spent my life as a journalist navigating these fault lines. Nothing in war is more potent than memory, twisted into myth to turn neighbor into foe. I have spent my life as a Jew whose forebears came from the Lithuanian shtetl, sifting through the emotional toll of lost places and lost people. Genocide is generational, a trauma passed down. Moving on is not as simple as it sounds. The undercurrent of unbelonging takes a toll on the heart. We Americans derive much of our strength as a nation from the capacity to forget. A nation of immigrants, we left the blood feuds and the famine and the wars and the horror over there in the places that seemed, in their fixed structures of immemorial oppression, to offer no hope. Our gaze was set forward. We became an experiment in an idea that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In so doing, in forging a nation that was an idea, not a matter of bloodlines, we gave and still give hope to the myriad lost of the earth. Perhaps no single sentence has ever been more transformative or more liberating. America remains a beacon, as this naturalized American can attest. But of course, being human, we fell short. Black slaves had no rights, unalienable or otherwise. Nations prefer to pass over the somber chapters of their history. Memorializing the crimes of others is much easier than memorializing one's own. If human beings were not so ingenious in averting their gazes from the truth of the matter, the kernel of their pain, there would be no need for psychiatry. I live in France, which emerged from World War II on the side of the victors. In reality, it had suffered what Marc Bloch, a historian, called the strange defeat that led to Vichy and French collaboration in the rounding up and deportation of more than 70,000 Jews. It took France a half century from the end of the war for President Jacques Chirac in 1995 to avow the truth with these words: yes, the criminal folly of the occupiers was seconded by the French state. Until then, the dispatch of Jews to their deaths from French soil had been the Nazis' crime alone, while an eternal France, true to the values of its 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, resided elsewhere, in some imagined cocoon of virtue. Yes, there was the heroism of de Gaulle and the resistance. There was also the Veldiv, Drancy, and the boxcars of the doomed, with their battered valises containing a few possessions that would prove pitifully purposeless. I recall when I visited Auschwitz in 1978, during the Cold War, seeing the mountain of twisted wire formed by the spectacles left behind by the dead. They had brought their glasses. They wanted to read. But all the Germans saw in the Jews was vermin. William Dodd, the American ambassador to Germany between Hitler's rise to power in 1933 and 1937, laid out the Nazi ideology in 1938. The central idea behind it is to make the rising generation worship their chief and get ready to save civilization from the Jews, from communism, and from democracy, thus preparing the way to a Nazified world. The State Department overrode his recommendation that no US diplomat attend the 1937 Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. The US government could not claim it did not know. Varian Fry, an American writer and teacher, who for a year led a rescue operation in Marseille for artists and writers, most of them hounded Jews, returned to the United States in late 1941. He had, by the way, to battle the US consulate in Marseille in order to try and do that. The consul general in Marseille was vehemently opposed to his operation. He wrote an article entitled The Massacre of the Jews. It was published in the New Republic on December 22, 1942. December 22, 1942. Fry spoke of 2 million Jews already slain, millions more facing annihilation at the hands of the Nazis, and said this: there is starvation. Jews all over Europe are kept on rations, often only 1/3 or 1/4 what is allowed to non-Jews. Slow death is the inevitable consequence. There is deportation. Jews by the hundreds of thousands have been packed into cattle cars without food, water, or sanitary conveniences of any sort, and shipped the whole breadth of Europe. When the cars arrive at their destination, about 1/3 of the passengers are already dead. There are the extermination centers, where Jews are destroyed by poison gas or electricity. There are specially constructed trucks in which Jews are asphyxiated by carbon monoxide from the exhausts on their way to burial trenches. There is burning alive in crematoria, in buildings deliberately set on fire. There is the method of injecting air bubbles into the bloodstream. It is cheap, clean and efficient, producing clots, embolisms, and death within a few hours. And there is the good old-fashioned system of standing the victims up, very often naked, and machine gunning them, preferably beside the graves they themselves have been forced to dig. It saves time, labor, and transportation. Here were the facts of the Holocaust, related in fashion timely enough to do something, to stop or slow Hitler's industrialized mass murder of the Jews, otherwise known as the Endlösung, or final solution. In Zagare, the Lithuanian town of my forebears, on October 2, 1941, all the Jews were rounded up on the market square before being taken into the forest and shot. The German commanders celebrated the murder of 2,263 Jews. A witness later described how small children had their heads smashed by being swung against trees to save ammunition. My grandmother would have been among the victims had my family not fled the Russian pogroms of the 1890s and made its way to South Africa. Yet more than 2 years would pass from the publication of Frey's excoriation before the Soviet liberation of Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, and several more months before the American liberation of Dachau on April 29, 1945, not to mention Majdanek and Chełmno, Belzec, and Sobibor. 2 million dead Jews became 6 million dead Jews. 2 of every 3 of Europe's estimated 9 million Jews perished. America and the world, for the most part, looked away. In the joint statement on atrocities, issued in October 1943 by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, there was no mention of the Jews, although by then several million had been gassed or shot. Everyone, as the historian Timothy Snyder has observed, could have done more and instead did less. My own newspaper, the New York Times, was among the evasive, alluding, for example, to the hundreds of thousands of persons inside the Warsaw Ghetto and how many of those persons were herded to their deaths at Treblinka. We meant Jews. So it was that the Americans liberating Dachau could not believe their eyes. Right here in Columbia, in its memorial park, at the Holocaust Memorial that is a tribute to Lily Filler's determination and wisdom, we can read the words of one liberator. Immune to shock, inured to horror, as he puts it, he was still overcome by the scale and extent of the savagery. Here, the averted gaze yields to what is visible. That is what journalism is still about. Boots on the ground, bearing witness, seeing it with your own eyes. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As the writer Daniel Mendelsohn, many of whose family perished in the Holocaust, has said, the United States basically did its absolute utmost to make it as difficult as possible for Jewish refugees to escape the maelstrom that was engulfing them. There were reasons. The toll of World War I was still felt. The Great Depression had accentuated insecurity. Isolationism was strong. The United States was far from alone in its largely closed borders. In fact, it let in more Jewish refugees between 1933 and 1945 than any other country, but not enough, not nearly enough. There are few heroes in this story. How then are we to understand, ladies and gentlemen, our evasions, our looking away, our dissimulations, our inclination and capacity to be bystanders to systematic slaughter? How and why do we render the visible invisible? Human beings have limited imaginations. The monstrous is what monsters do, not humans. The unthinkable is called that for a reason. Before the storming of the Capitol on Jan 6, 2021, who would have envisaged this direct attack on our democracy or the encouragement for it from a sitting United States president? Entire nations may sleepwalk into disaster. As the French poet Victor Hugo wrote, Nothing is more imminent than the impossible. Human beings are susceptible to hatred. They cede easily to the scapegoating of others and the idea that these others, Jews, Armenians, the Tutsi in Rwanda, Bosnian Muslims, the Rohingya, so-called Ukrainian fascists, are responsible for their woes. Hatred is an elixir, a potent political bomb, a seductive answer to the unbearable banality of life. It ushers the lone individual into a consoling tribe. It brings to tired faces a rictus of arousal at the sight of the savior. In her poem Hatred, the Nobel Prize-winning Polish poet Wisława Szymborska wrote, "Since when does brotherhood draw crowds? Has compassion ever finished first?" Human beings are also hardwired to survival. They live in fear. It does not take much to turn them into sheep. The hardest thing to teach a guide dog is disobedience, the refusal to step out into a busy street when there's an oncoming truck. The survival of humanity depends on the capacity to refuse an order from a superior when necessary. Germans still live in the shame of their failure in this regard. They saluted the unconscionable. Few resist. In a time of terror, the great mass is compliant, calculating, or cowed. The righteous, by contrast, move to an inner compass. Their anonymous acts, however pointless, constitute the most powerful rebuke to perpetrator and bystander. Resistance to evil is never pointless, even if short-lived or doomed. As Hannah Arendt put it in a sentence that touches on our essences as living beings, under conditions of terror, most people will comply, but some will not. Humanely speaking, no more is required, and no more can reasonably be asked for this planet to remain a fit place for human habitation. I was recently in Russia, and think now of the truth speakers languishing in Vladimir Putin's prison camps, the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, the outspoken Kremlin critic Vladimir Kara-Murza, both of them, incidentally, Putin tried to poison, the war critic Ilya Yashin, the theater director Yevgenia Berkovich, the playwright Svetlana Petrichuk, and countless other writers and poets who have raised their voices against gathering tyranny. Please do not forget them. I make these general observations about our natures after covering wars in Lebanon and Bosnia and Ukraine after the past 4 decades, and after wrestling with the mystery of our recurrent tribal destructiveness. Global connectedness, now linking to humanity to a degree unimaginable when I was born, has not laid to rest this hearkening for blood, as those dozens of bodies in black plastic bags laid out in Bucha, Ukraine, beneath weeping birches laden with mistletoe, made clear. This too is our nature. It is in us. Allow me to return for a moment to our imagination deficit as it applies to Americans and the Holocaust. That Germany, the land of Goethe and Beethoven, would set out to annihilate European Jewry, render the entire continent and eventually the entire world Judenrein or Jew-free, was too much to believe. Yet from 1933 to 39, from Hitler's assuming power to the outbreak of World War II, waves of anti-Semitic legislation, and Kristallnacht in 1938, when 1,400 synagogues were torched and dozens killed, left little reasonable doubt as to what was coming. Hugo's impossible is discounted until it happens. A buffoon, people say, a clown, an imposter, a charlatan, a fool. We know something of this. Until Hitler orders Jews into boxcars, transporting them to gas chambers where mothers clutching their infants leave scratch marks on the walls. Most Americans, swayed by the anti-Semitism of Henry Ford or Charles Lindbergh or the radio preacher Father Charles Coughlin, continued to oppose loosening immigration law, even as Hitler's murderous program took hold across Europe from France to Poland. In December 1942, Edward R. Murrow described events in Europe in a radio dispatch that could scarcely have been clearer, much like what Fry wrote at pretty much the same time. What is happening is this, he said in his radio broadcast. Millions of human beings, most of them Jews, are being gathered up with ruthless efficiency and murdered. Again, that was 2 years and 4 months, 2 years and 4 months before the liberation of Dachau. Not one railway track bearing the victims to these murderous camps was ever bombed. Of course, to know, you need to want to know. To act may require unusual courage. How often in war zones have I thought, there, but for the grace of God? There are always 1,000 reasons for not doing the right thing. We throw around the word hero, but to rise above fear, racist prejudice, heartless calculation, sheep-like acquiescence, the cynical reasoning that is sometimes called realism, and put your life on the line to defeat evil is rare. The world does not abound in heroes. Americans, not all of them, but most, preferred to look away from the Holocaust, even as our forces played a decisive role in saving the world from the full application of Hitler's sinister designs and preserving life and liberty on this earth. The Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin coined the word genocide in 1944 and embarked on a campaign for its recognition as a crime under international law. In 1946, the United Nations General Assembly voted a resolution recognizing such a crime, and in 1948, the Genocide Convention was signed. It defined genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, and it obligated state parties to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. The United States, conscious of its own foundational and seemingly unavowable genocide of the indigenous peoples of this continent, and wary of the intrusion of international covenants on its sovereignty, took 40 years to sign the convention. But it did sign and ratify the convention in 1988, and that is important. Even in a world where the balance of power is shifting and American power is no longer determinant, American leadership is important. It's critical. If liberty, democracy, open societies, a free press, an independent judiciary, and human rights, all the things I believe in, are to be defended against the predations of the new autocrats. Look at Beijing, look at Moscow, look in many places around the world. As a nation that is also an idea, we must uphold our values or we are nothing. One reason our recent history and current politics are so troubling to me. That the convention has not put an end to genocide is clear. In Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Darfur, in Burma, we've seen proof of that. This does not make the convention any less important. As I've said, to fall short is human. Ours is the society of constant churn and reinvention. We Americans recognize that failure is intrinsic to life, but we get up, we try again. As Samuel Beckett put it, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. Covering the Bosnian War in 1994 and 95, living under the Serbian shelling of Sarajevo that killed and maimed the civilians I lived beside for 2 years, I grew used to the grotesque circumlocutions with which Western leaders tried to explain away their inaction. The talk of millennial conflicts in the Balkans, of the intractability or impossibility of curtailing the region's innate proclivity for violence, of the supposed culpability of all sides, of so-called protected areas, which, as the slaughter of Bosnian Muslims at Srebrenica in 1995 demonstrated, were not protected at all by United Nations peacekeepers in blue helmets or anyone. The facts, to anyone on the ground were as clear as when Varian Fry put pen to paper or Edward R. Murrow broadcast. The Serbs, whipped into a frenzy by the hateful nationalist rhetoric of Slobodan Milosevic, had embarked on a genocidal campaign against those Muslims that left tens of thousands of them dead. It took a decade, until 2005, for the United States to recognize these Serbian acts as genocide. During the war, several United States Foreign Service officers quit the State Department in protest at the failure of the United States to acknowledge this genocide in a timely manner. The thing about the Convention on Genocide, of course, is that such recognition demands action of signatory states. Once you recognize the genocide, you are bound to act. Not all states want to act. So that recognition is something that is deeply reflected upon. Once again, looking away or explaining away was easier. Late in the war, Ron Knightsky, a noble American Foreign Service officer, one of the countless I have met across the world during my career, handed me a letter lambasting the US government and the State Department, quote, for repeatedly and gratuitously dishonoring the Bosnians in the very hour of their genocide, and urging future Foreign Service officers to be, quote, guided by the belief that a policy fundamentally at odds with our national conscience cannot endure indefinitely if that conscience is well and truthfully informed. I took that away from the war, the indivisibility of integrity, and the importance of a single dissenting voice. We learn, we unlearn, we learn again. Slowly we advance. Progress is not linear, it's a crab walk. In conclusion, there is a war in Europe again. Once more, the unthinkable, once more, the impossible are upon us. President Putin has spoken more than once of nuclear war. Nationalism and xenophobic hatred do their work. The fantastical idea pushed through Putin's propaganda that Ukraine is run by Nazis and fascists revives memories of the Red Army's heroic march to Berlin in 1945. Perhaps 200,000 Ukrainians and Russians, mainly young men, many of them 19, 20, 18, 21, already dead before they lived in an unnecessary, unprovoked war. Europe, the Europe I love. I'm very patriotic about Europe, as I am also about the United States. There's a very important distinction between patriotism and nationalism. I won't go into that right now. Europe, so painstakingly pieced together from the ruins of 1945, must witness again the indiscriminate shelling of cities, the execution of civilians with their hands tied behind their backs, torture, rape, the reduction of towns like Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine to rubble. At times, I feel a deep despair. It goes beyond the war. I feel that technology is dehumanizing us, diminishing human contact, turning our gazes inward. The important thing is no longer to see the Mona Lisa. It is to have a selfie taken in front of the Mona Lisa. I wonder about the world in which my grandchildren will live. And yet, in the end, I can only be a creature of hope. You see, ladies and gentlemen, I was raised in part in South Africa, where a cataclysm always loomed during my youth, but was avoided through leadership and imagination. It was avoided by statesmanship, almost forgotten word, by two men, Mandela and de Klerk, who placed the future over the past. Victimhood, the fetishistic obsession with the wounds of history leads only to more bloodshed. That is something, I think, that the United States of America understands. We will never agree on the past. That does not matter, so long as we can agree not to live in it. I am a Jew. Trees have roots. Jews have legs, as the old saying goes. We know as no other people what it is to be cast out, to be persecuted, to wander without a homeland. This, over millennia, was our fate. Everywhere we carried with us a covenant with a formless, faceless God, a covenant of ethics. At the heart of those ethics stand Rabbi Hillel's words: that which is hateful to yourself, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole Torah. The rest is just commentary. Many things are contained in those ancient words, not least, in my view, an admonition to the Jews to seek peace with the Palestinians, now a people without a homeland. It's very difficult. It's very difficult, more so by the day. But as we have seen, the impossible is possible. In my end is my beginning. There is history, and then there are its uses. Let us put history to good use and be educated rather than blinded by it. Let us see the visible, not avert our gaze. Let us have the courage not to be bystanders. Let us preserve the threatened idea of truth for the sake of our fragile planet and our tenuous humanity. Let us, as W.H. Auden put it on the eve of World War II, reach beyond negation and despair to show an affirming flame. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, we'll take questions. So just raise a hand and one of us will.
What do the European leaders think should be done in the war in Ukraine? We watch television and see all these buildings getting bombed and civilians getting killed, and we sit there over dinner and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe more is not being done." Is there more that can be done, or is status quo and just time going to run out eventually on the Ukrainians?
Well, more could be done, but if more were done, the consequence could be World War III. I mean, the only way really that more could be done at this point, given the amount being spent chiefly by the United States and the amount of arms and weapons and other support of all kinds to Ukraine, the only further step would be sending US forces or Allied forces into Ukraine. And at that point, I think we would have to take very seriously Vladimir Putin's nuclear threats, his threats to use so-called strategic nuclear weapons, smaller nuclear weapons. I'm not convinced by how small a nuclear weapon can be. And that is, I think, why President Biden has drawn a pretty hard line on that, and why in Vilnius now, the West, the Allies, again said to Ukraine, as we did in 2008, your future is in NATO, but did not extend an invitation right there and then, because if Ukraine joins NATO while it's at war, under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, we have to go to war. We have to go to war against Russia. That's a pretty compelling reason, at least in my view, not to do that. What will happen in the war is unclear. I think it'll be a long war. If there were a strong Ukrainian military breakthrough in this counteroffensive, that could change things in Russia, but I think that's probably unlikely. The counteroffensive was broadcast to the world 9 months ago. Normally, an element of surprise in war is useful. The Russians are many things, but they're not stupid. They have mined and mined and mined that terrain and dug themselves in like nobody's business. That land will be mined for a half century or century to come. So it's difficult, but I think you can look at what's happening perhaps this way. President Putin wanted to wipe Ukraine from the map. That is not going to happen. President Zelensky has already won a victory. Ukraine, however that country, wherever the borders of that country are eventually drawn, Ukraine, I believe, will join the European Union and will join eventually NATO, and it will be a free country. So that is a victory. A second victory, if you like, would be to push Russia back to the February 23 lines. A third victory would be to recover all its land, including Crimea. And the question for President Zelensky is, how many victories will he settle for? I read recently that 74% of families in Ukraine now have a family member or a friend who has been killed or wounded in the war, 74%. So what territorial gain, what human sacrifice, what further human sacrifice should be borne for what degree of territorial gain? Remember that Germany waited decades to be whole again. It never gave up on East Germany. And with the help of Western resolve and patience, it became whole again. Perhaps Ukraine should look at the complete recovery of its territory through that prism. I don't know. I'm just throwing out ideas. But I do not think that we're going to see the end of President Putin soon. I may be wrong. I think Russia, I mean, as Napoleon learned, as Hitler learned, the strategic depth of Russia, a country the size, almost the size of the United States and Canada combined, is almost limitless. So it's a very difficult situation. It weighs very heavily on Europe. The danger, of course, is that we grow accustomed to this war and lose the indignation that we need to feel over it. And of course, Putin is looking at the American election next year and making his calculations. It was very interesting that among the Americans banned from visiting Russia in May on a long list was Brad Raffensperger, this Georgian Secretary of State, who refused to do a recount when Trump said he should move a few votes over to his side. Now, what does Russia have? What business does Russia have banning him from entering Russia? Well, it's a nod and a wink to Trump, right? Yeah.
You've spoken movingly of the darkness of human affairs. Is there any development or action, however nascent, that gives you hope?
Well, yeah, I'm sorry if the speech was a bit dark. Sometimes I feel that. And of course, this subject is not a light one. I am moved by the commitment that I feel in a younger generation to save our planet. Put very, William, who's in the audience here, told me the temperature in Tehran was 150 degrees today. I don't know if we should believe what comes out of Iran. Anyway, it was very hot. So, but there's a commitment, I think, among young people to reimagine the way we live, to save the planet. I think the sort of inbred racism that has been with us for so long is beginning maybe to disappear. I mean, I feel that among young people. I feel they don't think in those terms. But, you know, to be honest, at almost 68, I don't really know the way young people think. That's one of the reasons I gave up my column, because I thought that so much of what goes on today in the areas of technology and other areas was very hard for me to understand, you know, and that I should probably leave the space to somebody else a little younger to write about what's happening in the world. But no, I do derive some hope from that. I mean, what has happened in Europe has been, very brutal for me. I really believe that the construction of the European Union, arriving at a Europe whole and free, the banishment of war from a continent that had committed suicide repeatedly in the first half of the 20th century. This, to me, was the great achievement of the first decades of my life. And to see that begin to unravel, to see the utter stupidity of a normally prudent nation hurling itself over the white cliffs of Dover in one of the craziest acts that I, have witnessed, at least in recent years. I'm referring, of course, to Brexit. It just said to me that something has changed in our world. And of course, in the United States, we had a president who, for the first time, did not believe at all in the European Union, did not at all believe in NATO, thought Vladimir Putin was a pretty good guy and probably knew more about what went on in our, what had really gone on in our 2016 election than our own intelligence services. So, a lot of weird shit, if I'm allowed to say that, weird stuff has been going down of late. And a lot of it to me has been profoundly perplexing and troubling. But as I said, there's a core of optimism in me, and democracies are slow to anger, but when they do, watch out. And I think that the democracies of the world, will fight hard to preserve themselves. And I think the Biden administration, in most regards, has done a pretty good job.
First of all, thank you so very much for coming and for the amount of work that it took to brought you here. It's meaningful to all of us. My 4 grandparents raised their children in Lithuania, Lithuania. And my grandparents, my paternal grandfather escaped to South Africa, which I found was really interesting, yes, and raised a branch of our family. But unfortunately, many of our family members were part of the massacre that we know about in Lithuania. But I'm here, and I have children, 30-year-old children, and they have children. And so the license plate of South Carolina says, "While I breathe, I hope." Right?
Okay.
And so all we can do is say that we are still alive, Am Yisrael Chai, and we can continue. And we can continue these kind of programs where we educate our children so that they understand, because everything is oral tradition, and so that they can understand, so that it shall never happen again.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much.
That's a pleasure. Thank you. Yeah, speaking to Lily today and hearing how her parents survived Auschwitz, you don't really drive around Columbia, South Carolina and think that you're one generation from a death camp in Poland. But these are the human threads that make up the world. And as you say, America is a place of building new lives. And I've been deeply concerned in all I've written, really, because my family has moved every generation for 3 or 4 generations with this whole idea of new beginnings, but also the loss of what's left behind.
We talk about what happened in the past.
There you are. Yeah.
We're looking today, and certainly January 6th was a shed mark, but we look at day after day the reports of the rising anti-Semitism, of the attacks on synagogues, of the white supremacist groups being in the police department and in the cabinet and throughout our political system. And a lot of people are talking about it is happening here and we're standing by.
You're talking about the United States.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
What are we doing? What can we be doing Do you see it that way? And if not, where do you see the differences?
Well, I find it hard. I mean, certainly the trends that you referred to are there, but I think the Jewish community in the United States is extremely strong, and that resistance to those kinds of trends is powerful. And I don't see the United States on the verge of slipping into some anti-Semitic nightmare of the kind we've been talking about tonight. I think the United States of America is probably still the best place in the world for a Jew to be, I guess, along with Israel. And Israel at the moment, of course, has its problems, many of them. So I would be cautious about that. I don't think it's a moment to panic or to feel we're going over the top into some terrible thing of the kind we've been talking about tonight. I don't feel that. I don't see it, at least for the moment.
Please tell us about Jewish communal life in Paris and France.
Okay.
We have a very strong Jewish community here,
Right.
and we hear about anti-Semitism in France, and
there's been
immigration from North Africa and such.
France. Every time the Middle East blows up, France has tended to blow up over the past decade or so, at least. The tensions between Jews and Muslims spill over into France easily because France has the largest Jewish community in Western Europe by some distance, and it also has the largest Muslim community in Western Europe. And there have been Jewish cemeteries have been desecrated. There have been crimes involving the murder for anti-Semitic reasons of 2 Jewish women, at least in recent years, and the tensions are there. There's no question about that. And many French Jewish people have left France and have gone to Israel. There has been an exodus, not a massive exodus, but a significant exodus. Some of that might be related to greater economic opportunity in Israel, more than to a sense of being under attack in France. But in most cases, it's at least some combination. I think, I've attended synagogue, several times. I would say Jewish communal life in France is alive and well, but there's a wariness. I mean, synagogues tend to be quite heavily protected by the police. There have been attacks in the metro on people wearing a kippah. But again, I'd be cautious about going too far. I think a Jew in France still lives well, but there's more wariness than there was.
I'd like to thank you, first of all, for coming and sharing your wisdom. I teach 9th and 10th graders.
Yeah.
And I'm noticing each year a hopelessness in kids with school shootings. And we had a church shooting in our town in Charleston. And they're seeing these government officials like in Hungary and in Israel that are trying to change their government for what we would say a negative thing. They saw the attack on the White House, on the Capitol. But give me some of your wisdom that I can give to my kids to help them stay hopeful. I do the best I can to make them globally aware,
Right.
so that they don't just look at what's happening right in South Carolina or the
Right.
United States.
Right.
But I really
So
have
they're
seen
depressed about the state of this country, of their country.
they're just depressed about the world.
Right.
They see we just got through COVID. They were
Yeah.
in middle school during COVID,
Right.
and they see what's happening in Ukraine, and I don't know what to tell kids that they can do. It's
Right.
over there. What can they do?
Yeah.
So I don't know how to encourage them to feel powerful rather than powerless.
Hmm. Well, that's very worrying. I mean, I said in my remarks that I do worry about this, the way technology is, taking over our lives, and the amount of time kids spend staring at a little screen. And I'm grateful that I passed more than half of my life before a cell phone came along, and you'd get in a cab and you just gaze out the window because there was nothing else to do, and you'd dream and you'd observe and all that seems a very far away. And I do worry about the feelings of isolation, almost extreme isolation that many kids seem to feel. And it's very troubling. I was actually very moved today when Lee showed me around the library here. I mean, it seemed to me to speak of something that's fading from our lives. And here was a big space that's free, that's open to everyone, that's open to the community, where families can come, where kids can come, where adults can come, where you can apply for jobs, where you can do carpentry, where you can make tapestries, and I just think it's very cool. And I think the commons, the kinds of places where this kind of thing happens. I mean, I remember the public library when I was growing up was a very important place in London, near where I lived, where I used to go. I meant what I said about journalism. I mean, people think you can do journalism, picking up the phone, or, all the information you could possibly imagine is available, in 5 seconds if you Google it. That's not it. You don't understand anything until you look somebody in the eye. You understand nothing. You understand nothing until you're in a place and you can smell it and feel it and touch it, and that sultry southern air. You can't get that over the phone, or those avenues of live oaks. And anyway, I digress. But how to give them hope? Go out into the world. Believe in something. Work hard. That's important. And there's still a lot to be done. There's a lady at the back.
We'll take this one last question, so we can get him to signing.
Thank you also for being here. It's very meaningful. I'm an educator as well, and I can take a lot back to the classroom with this, just the political literacy and teaching democratic ideals, no matter what content we're teaching as educators, just that foundation interwoven. But question I had was, were you on the ground as a journalist or war correspondent during the Kosovo War in 99, 98?
I was on the ground there at one point. Yeah.
And were you there when the U.S. began to bomb, or did you exit?
I was not there when the U.S. began to bomb, and of course, Vladimir Putin has never forgotten that. And if you're in Russia, you hear a lot about that. What's so different? NATO bombs Kosovo and approves of NATO bombs Belgrade and approves of Kosovo's independence from Serbia, breaking away from Serbia. So what's so different? Not to mention Iraq. So the world is complex. I was in Kosovo. I was mainly in Bosnia, and I wrote a book about the Bosnian War called Hearts Grown Brutal: Sagas of Sarajevo. And that was a very formative, as the Ukraine war for this generation of journalists is an absolutely formative event. Covering the war in Bosnia was for me. And, seeing war in Europe, seeing concentration camps in Europe through which the Bosnian Muslims were processed, many of them, not death camps, but concentration camps where males of fighting age were often killed, was something that I had never imagined, which goes back to one of the points I tried to make in my remarks about the unimaginable. It's around the corner. And that's also a reason not to give up hope, to persevere. I never thought the Bosnian War would end. I couldn't see how it would be ended, but it was ended in 1995 through brilliant American diplomacy. It was ended in an ugly way. Most compromises are ugly. The Serbs got 49% of Bosnia. Wars end most often or very often in painful compromise, and that could also be the case in Ukraine. Certainly worth bearing in mind. Thank you. Thank you all.
On behalf of the South Carolina Council on the Holocaust and the Richland Library, we want to thank you so much for your comments and for your ability to answer our questions. I'd like to invite you all to book signing if you're interested in purchasing one of the books, and Mr. Cohen will be eager to sign them. And I want to remind you that we have many more events and activities that are going on. Pick up a schedule of what's coming in the next several weeks, and you can go online. There's a link to your library, and it will also outline everything that is going to be available, of course, free to the public. Bring your friends and your family. Once again, I think, why don't we give Mr. Cohen a big hand? Thank you. Thank you.